I'm Botanical Lich, and here is the bee. I was thinking about wages today, specifically the gap between the living wage and the minimum wage. So, what is a living wage? Living wage is what some government agency has determined is the minimum amount of money in the United States to be able to live a respectable life. There's some weird wiggle room in it because there is a lot of questions in, what is respectable or what is the minimum standard of living, as well as there's quite a few people who are like, the amount of money that you're claiming you can do this on is actually not enough to do those things on, just physically. It just isn't enough. But we're going to set that aside for now, because what I really wanted to talk about is that there are people who don't think that minimum wage should be living wage, and how that's a weird gap, and how that gap has to be filled by something, or you don't get to those minimum standards of living. So there's usually two main arguments about why minimum wage shouldn't be a living wage. And the first one is that it'll make things too expensive. And I've got some arguments against that, and I don't think that's a valid argument. But the one that I was really interested in talking about today was the idea that there are some jobs that are not worth being paid a living wage. And usually the defense of that is, well, they're a starter job or they're a trainee job. And there's two arguments against that question that I've heard, at least. The first one just being a simple, hey, do you want those jobs to exist? And I think further enforced by, do you just think that inexperienced employees should always be doing those jobs? So these are some jobs frequently that are like McDonald's employees, baristas, cashiers, and things at stores. And these same people are the ones that are service workers that people get very upset at when they're not really good at their jobs. If they don't do everything perfectly, I'm going to get upset. But also it's a trainee job that only inexperienced people should take. Okay, sure. But my main problem that I was thinking about today is the idea that trainee or starter jobs don't really make sense as a thing. Mostly because of this gap between minimum and living wage. Because that gap has to be filled by something. We're going to assume that gap is being filled by something. And if you support the idea of there being starter or trainee jobs, then you support the idea that someone should be filling in that gap in wages. And it's just really interesting to me because these are very frequently the same people who think it's your responsibility to be able to support yourself. And these starter jobs, these trainee jobs, don't do that. And they might say, oh, well, just do more work, get another job on top of that. And my response to that is, no, I don't think that's correct. I think that working 40 hours a week is more than enough, should be more than enough to have a living wage. I think that should be more than enough to just simply sustain yourself and your life, to keep you in working condition for an employer. Because after sleep and doctor's visits and all this stuff you have to do for the government, you barely have a time for yourself. And these same people who think that you should have to support yourself just don't seem to acknowledge that someone has to meet that gap, to meet those minimum living requirements. So, very frequently, the people in these trainee jobs or starter jobs are between 16 and 20 years old, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those groups. 16 and 17-year-olds are people who, there is already someone responsible for filling that gap, for getting them to a livable condition. And so there could be an argument that 16 and 17-year-olds could make under a living wage because there is already someone responsible for filling that gap to living conditions, to living wage. But that is a wild argument to me because that would mean that you are specifically designing jobs for children. And I don't think we should be doing that. Hot take, Botanical Lich, hot take. We shouldn't be designing jobs for children. That's bad. So, we're set aside 16 and 17-year-olds. So, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. That group is a group that the people who defend these positions as starter jobs or trainee jobs, and because of that, the minimum wage shouldn't be living wage. These people, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, are of an age that those same people think you should be able to support yourself at. And these trainee jobs don't allow for that. So, if you are at that age group, someone is filling that gap for you. Someone is filling the gap between minimum wage and living wage. You get to a point where either you have to support the idea that a parent should be taking care of their child, should be meeting those requirements, should be filling that gap up past the legal age of adulthood, or that there should be something else to fill that gap. And that doesn't really jive with me either. Parents, there are a lot of families who don't have the income to fill that gap anyway, because there are a lot of families where they only have one income that may just be barely living wage for that family. So once their children have reached adulthood, they can't really afford to fill that living wage gap for them anymore. And they shouldn't have to. The big point is, I think they shouldn't have to fill that gap anymore. If an 18-year-old is working a job, they should be able to care for themselves. They shouldn't have to, but they should be able to, no matter what job they're working. And this will be looping back, but again, if you are at a trainee or starter job, a job where your wage is under the living wage, part of your living expenses has to be covered by some other party. If you want to look at it in an extremely materialistic transactional way, living wage is the amount of money you need to remain a contributing member of society. Now, I don't think everyone needs to be a contributing member of society, and I think that's a really weird way to think about that. But it does kind of bring about another weird idea where if you're working a job under living wage, someone is helping pay for you to stay a contributing employee. That job, that employer is getting benefits from someone else, paying for you to be able to live well enough that you can go and work for that employer. Someone is supplementing that employer's cost rather than them paying enough money for you to live and work for them. That's wild to me. And again, I want to go back to these people who are like, yes, we should have trainee jobs, we should have starter jobs. Someone has to fill that gap. And these people who believe these jobs should exist, don't want the government to fill that gap. They don't want the business to fill that gap, which means it has to be close friends and family members to fill those gaps. Now, our friends and family are supplementing the businesses we're working for because they don't want to pay us enough for us to be able to continue working for them. What? That's wild. And I know I've been talking a lot about, it's like an 18, 19, 20-year-old. But those aren't the only people that find themselves in these situations. You could have a parent who is fired from their job because of an injury or a loss of ability, or because cutbacks is actually usually just what it is. A stock wants to make their number go up, so they cut employees so they can predict less spending for the next quarter. So you have a parent that loses that job. Now that parent can't get a new job. They can't even go into the field that they were in because of ageism or whatever. So they end up taking one of these minimum wage jobs, which is under the living wage. And now they're the ones who need this supplemental income, this supplemental wage. They need someone to fill the gap between minimum wage and living wage. So while I think that more frequently we think about this as parents helping their adult children meet this living wage to fill this gap by providing free housing or food or just supplemental income to deal with problems like a car breaking down, it just as easily can be a child providing free housing for an adult parent, or someone providing free housing for their friend, or picking up groceries for them. These are all places where, because of how our society is structured, we're having to supplement a business so that they can have an employee that they aren't giving enough resources to live, to continue to be a contributing employee, to continue to function. And it's just wild to me that there are a group of people who look at that situation and say, that's fine. That's how our society should work. I shouldn't have to fulfill that gap. I shouldn't have to fill that gap for somebody. the government shouldn't have to fill that gap, because really that would just be me filling that gap because I'm wealthy and I don't want poor people taking my money. And as one of these people, not only do I not want to fill that gap, I think it's fine that people live in that gap. I think it's fine that people live in the gap between working and being able to live. I think it's fine that there are people who have jobs and contribute to those jobs and yet don't have enough money to live. I just don't think that's a tenable situation for society. I don't think that you have a functioning society, a properly functioning society, or a properly functioning government, if you are forced to either care for each other or let each other die. Because no one else is stepping in to fill that gap. The government isn't filling that gap. These employers aren't filling this gap. None of these groups are saying, if you work, we're going to make up that gap. We're going to make sure that you can live. If you work, you get to live. Which it's such a wild thing that I'm sitting here arguing for, if you work, you should get to live. I want to be very clear, I think, that even people who don't work, who contribute nothing to society, not that I think there actually are people that contribute nothing to society, but if there were people that contributed nothing to society, I think those people should get to live too. And yet here I am, having to argue that people who are doing the thing, they're doing capitalism, they're doing it right, they have a job. I have to argue that those people should get to live. I have to argue that those people should have a place that they know that they're going to be able to come home and have a place to lay down and food to eat. That's wild. That's the society we're living in. And there's going to be people who are like, well, if you work, then the government gives you subsidies. There's SNAP, there's child tax credits, there's this and that, there's unemployment. But most places, that's not enough. I knew so many people, I have known so many people who have a job, a full-time job, and SNAP isn't enough to cover their food bills, even with their income, who have children, who the child care credits, the low-income child care credits, aren't enough to get them child care. They still can't afford it. So that's just not true. The subsidies don't fill those gaps, or at least they do something to fill it, but they don't completely bridge that gap. So the most obvious solution here, raise the minimum wage. Let's raise the minimum wage federally. Let's make the minimum wage a living wage. And that'd be great. I think that's a good start. That could be correct. I think that's probably the thing that you could get the most people behind. But that still leaves a lot of people out. And I think actually what would be a probably better solution is universal basic income. You raise the floor of every single person living in that society in the United States. Because that includes people without jobs. Either people who don't have jobs by choice, which really isn't a lot of people. People like having money because they like buying things. But it includes people who can't work. It includes people who are disabled. It includes people who have been fired through no fault of their own. And, really, people on the other side should be pretty happy about it too, because it lets businesses keep paying those lower wages. Woohoo! Because you're raising the floor. That gap between living wage and minimum wage shrinks automatically. Because to get to the amount of money that you need to live, the employers don't have to pay as much money. So that's what I was thinking about today. This gap, that it doesn't make sense that it exists. And the arguments for the gap existing make less and less sense the more you think about it. And right now, why is it that it's the responsibility of people who are close to each other to make up that gap? Why isn't the government supposed to make up that gap? Why shouldn't employers have to make up that gap? Why are we allowing that gap to exist? And I understand that I've gone through basically this whole ramble without really addressing the people who can't fill that gap. And that's because we all know what happens when people can't fill that gap. We've all seen it. We all can see the food insecurity, the housing insecurity, exposure, homelessness that is happening around the country because there are so many people who can't fill that gap. And I think, one, we should be thinking about how many more people wouldn't be able to fill that gap if they didn't have close friends and family members who could fill that gap for them. And maybe we should think a little bit about if there are people around us immediately who we can help try to fill that gap for, or even push them a little further beyond that gap being filled. But really, I think we just need to be talking about that gap more. We need to talk about the gap between living wage and minimum wage and talk about who that gap really puts pressure on. It doesn't hurt millionaires and billionaires when that gap isn't filled. It doesn't hurt businesses when that gap isn't filled. It doesn't hurt members of the government or socialites. It hurts people who are barely filling that gap themselves. If I have finally climbed to the point where my wage is above living wage, but my brother's not making a living wage, I'm helping him out. And now you've got two people who are living as if they're not above the living wage. Because it is those people, it is people near you, it is people near these people who are helping them. I think as well, I think this argument is a good one, because I think you might actually be able to convince some of these people to empathize with this argument. I think if you frame it as, well, if your daughter, your mother, your brother fell into one of these jobs where they weren't making a living wage, you would support them. And is that really fair to you? I don't think we should have a world where no one can rely on each other. I do think we should have a world where no one has to rely on their close friends or family members to get them to a point where they can live. But really it all boils down to, shouldn't there be some sort of institutional guarantee that if you work 40 hours a week, you can live off of that, rather than relying on Good Samaritans or nonprofits or family members and friends? Shouldn't someone else be doing that? Shouldn't either businesses or the government be doing that, making sure that we can live if we're working a full-time job? Someone should. That's what capitalism is. Work to live, or not, or work and don't get to live. I think I'm going to end there, because obviously I'm willing to talk about these things until my jaw falls off. So I want you to think about that gap, talk about that gap, and remember that freedom sprouts from the corpse of capitalism.